Depending on how old you are, you may be a father and may not have been present with your mother at giving birth to you. Now, I'm 57, so that definitely wasn't happening for me. But I can remember about 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, that I started to attend my two boys' birth. And I can tell you that it is one of the most exhilarating times in my life, but it was also the scariest because I didn't have a hot clue what to do in that moment and in those time. And while I can think that that may be a challenge for some men today, it's even more prevalent. It's just more popular for guys to be in there supporting our wives, not just going to prenatal classes, but also spending time with our wives and getting an understanding of what it is that they're going through. Well, today, my guest has performed more than 1,000 births, and he's going to help us help us fathers and soon to be fathers, and how we can show up better for our partners. Now, before we're going to get into all that, I just want to remind you that if you're a man who's been facing a challenge and that today just feels like too overwhelming, and we have this pain inside of us, and the pain is truly real, isn't it, for us? And it's a pain of loneliness and of unworthiness. And we mask this usually by anger and resentment. It's all because we're uncertain and afraid of what to do for that next step. So if you're tired and fed up with where your life is at, then I'm going to encourage you to start your hero's quest and become more, accomplish more, and live more than you've ever have. You can go to members.theawakenedman.net and use the code Revolutionary Man to get 20% off your quest. Now, let's get on with today's episode.
The average man today is sleepwalking through life, many never reaching their true potential, let alone ever crossing the finish line to living a purposeful life. Yet, the hunger still exists, albeit buried amidst his cluttered mind, misguided beliefs, and values that no longer serve him. It's time to align yourself for greatness. It's time to become a revolutionary man. Stay strong, my brother.
Welcome to the Revolutionary Man podcast. I'm the founder of the Awakened Man movement and your host, Alan DeMonso. Do you plan or have you been present for the birth of your children? And do you know how to support your partner through her pregnancy journey? As a father, it begins long before our partners are even pregnant. How we show up as husbands speaks loudly to the kind of fathers that we will become. Yet there isn't a manual for us to follow, is there? No books to read that focus on father's imprint onto the children. But there is a training available and a coach to guide us. So allow me to introduce my guest. Nathan Riley is an MD and a board-certified OBGYN and a fellow of the ACOG who left the medical industry into the industrial complex because of disillusionment with the standard of care and within that conventional maternity care model. And his mission is to uphold midwifery as the art that is to honor the birth of a sacred process and transition to parenthood as a spiritual transformation. Man, that sounds incredibly powerful. So Dr. Riley empowers women to have their babies on their own terms using their nature as their guide. And he helps fathers embrace that opportunity, connect with birth, with their parents through pregnancy and birth, encouraging them to go deeper versus distancing themselves from the stigmatized but magical rite of passage. Welcome to the show, Nathan. How are things, brother?
Oh my gosh. I don't know if I could have done a better introduction. That was beautiful. Thank you. I'm doing great today.
Yeah, right on. Thank you so much for being on the show. It was a little bit of a different take. This is one topic we have yet to talk about here at the Awakened Man and on the Revolutionary Man podcast. And I thought it was so relevant looking at your content and the work that you're doing. And as we were just coming on, we were, talking about how men can show up. But my opening question for all my guests is I really want to get to dive in a little bit more about yourself. And while I revealed a little bit about your story, tell us about a time in your life when you felt things needed to change. What did you do? How did that experience shape you into the man you are today and the work that you're doing?
Well, I think pretty cliche, but it goes back to losing my own father. He died of a bone marrow disease called multiple myeloma. It's a form of cancer that arose probably from exposure to Agent Orange while he was an airplane mechanic in Vietnam on an aircraft carrier. And, he was never a guy that worked out or did anything, but he was a laborer, big, strong guy. And when he got sick, I saw him, slowly, through the process of cachexia, where your body is basically eating itself. That's what happens with cancer patients. They just become withered away. He was small enough that I could actually hold him in my arms and carry him like a baby, which is a pretty, what's the word? Like profound isn't really the word, but it was one of those things that just unlocks something for you. And you start to realize that we're all going to just end up becoming little babies at the end of our life again. And when you see your father, you only get one dad. When you see your father start to wither away like that, you would expect that they're going to start talking about all of those things that they'd held kind of private. But he never really opened up. He was a mechanical engineer. He had this sort of way of thinking about, hey, here's the problem. Let's just fix it. And of course, this, like many cancers, almost every cancer, is just not fixable. So we just watched him continue to, quote, fight this until the very, very end, when he finally agreed to meet with palliative care. Palliative care is my other subspecialty, actually. I've got 2 board certifications, and the one is at end of life, the one is at beginning of life, so to speak, birth and death. And I hadn't chosen that as a subspecialty at the time. I was still in medical school when he passed away, but I remember him agreeing to meet with palliative care. And palliative care really helps to, they do a lot of symptom management. They do a lot of kind of family counseling and communication around the prognosis, around what treatment options are. They go into advanced directives, like what's going to come after, how can we support you through the medical structures in order to really reflect your values, your beliefs. But we didn't know any of that. The palliative care team got it out of him. And so I learned more about my father maybe in the last couple months of his life than I had for his entire time that I was alive, maybe 25 years at that time. So the experience there for me was understanding that this guy probably was deeply contemplative about a lot of the bigger questions, but he had been modeled for him by the men that had preceded him in his lineage to kind of just wrap that stuff up. That's not anybody's business. Don't burden them with that stuff. You're supposed to be strong and stoic, and and all of the men's groups that have popped up, I think, get into this, that it's okay to be emotional. It's okay to be, able to share what your fears are and whatnot. And he was deathly afraid of what was coming. And that was why he didn't want to talk about it. But through the clever conversations of this palliative care team, he really started opening up about his religious predispositions. And I don't know. I really think he was afraid of going to hell and that type of stuff. He never talked about religion, but I think he was worried. Maybe this is something I need to be thoughtful of. So anyways, that now as a father of my own, I've got a 3.5 and a 1.5-year-old at the time of this recording. I've had to decondition myself from that programming in order to serve these little girls, in order to have stood strong for my wife throughout her pregnancies and the birth of our babies, but also for all of the men that come through my practice, kind of as by proxy, because I'm taking care of their wives who are pregnant. And this used to be women's work, to grow a baby and have a baby. Well, men now want to be involved, as you said, but there's no guidebook out there. And I wish I had a guidebook, Alan, but I didn't. So I created it within this program that we just launched called the Born Free Method. But it's not just for dads. It's really for the unit to stand shoulder to shoulder and look off into the horizon together at uncertainty. And I think that's a really good jump off point, I think, for pretty much all of the work I do, is really kind of holding space for people and trying to get them to lean a little bit into this space, which is a little bit uncomfortable for us guys, I think, often.
Yeah, for sure. When I just listening to you, tell that story, I just want to say what a great way. I like how you put how your work has really catches the 2 ends of life, right? The birth and the end. And what a great way to really have to live a life of purpose. We talk a lot about in my work about living a life of purpose, on purpose. And you're definitely doing that. And then I just thinking about, being in that, going back to the time when my oldest was was being born, and my poor wife struggled for almost 2 full days in labor. And he was a big boy coming out 10 pounds, 9 pounds, 10 ounces. And, I said, The guy should have paid me rent, like really, for everything that he put my poor wife through at the time. But we feel useless. And that's at the end. And we were doing the birth, the prenatal classes and that, but I still didn't have a hot clue at all. And so as you've developed this work, and moving yourself away, like we talked about you having a bit of a disillusionment of how the standard of care is within this medical industrial complex. Tell us a little bit more about that disillusionment and how it's really pivoted and shifted to your work that you're doing.
Well, it kind of relates back to, people in my father's generation. You're a little bit older than me, but I think our parents probably kind of treated us the same way. It was, the role of my father was always to solve a problem. And that was something that I was pretty determined to push back against, even though it was deeply ingrained in me. Even in my wife and I met when we were 16, believe it or not. And she's this beautiful, humble, very capable, very emotionally intelligent woman. I mean, she really balances out my masculine energy. And if she comes to me with like, this bad thing happened, what do? We immediately jump to like, what's the problem to fix, right? And usually that's not really what she's coming to me for. Like, bro, I can fix this. All I need is for somebody to be a sounding board, to see me and bear witness to what I'm going through. Well, in the medical system, we're ingrained even more deeply with this sort of masculine tendency to be there to solve a problem. So if somebody comes to me with a medical issue, if I can't give them a solution, sometimes the consumer is demanding a solution, which is why we use so many pharmaceuticals and surgery before we do any sort of real lifestyle change in order to prevent disease or reverse chronic conditions. And when I went into medical school, I had just come off of an early exit in a career in Ironman distance triathlon. I was very, very determined to be able to race, run, swim, bike, and lift faster and stronger than anybody else. When I came out of that and I'm in medical school, I was thinking, wow, all of that stuff I learned on how to take care of myself, I'm going to do this in my practice. I'm going to be that guy. But I wasn't really being incentivized to do that. And especially when I chose obstetrics and gynecology, which, by the way, sort of ironically presented me with a question that I'll never have an answer to. Where do babies come from? Like, this is just completely way bigger than me. And that was really compelling as like the ultimate Gordian knot to unpack for the rest of my life and career. But I was expected to have the answer. I was expected to spend 7 minutes on average with a client and come to the answer quicker than everybody else. And with that modeled behavior, I would be rewarded with more training, larger paychecks, more time in the operating room, whatever. I'm rewarded with more work because I know the answers. And it wasn't satisfying to me because, similar to the way that most men for me modeled any of these conversations, was, hey, what's the problem? Let me fix it. I realized that me fixing a problem wasn't serving me in pregnancy and childbirth, because there is no problem here to fix. You are not sick by virtue of being pregnant, and birth is not a medical procedure. But I was trained really, really well in two things. OBGYNs are specialists in surgery and in sickness. And I wasn't seeing sick people. So what the hell is my role here? So I actually stopped doing a lot of the intervening, and I realized that they're having better birth outcomes. People are happier. They're recovering more quickly postpartum. They're not having as much trauma because I'm not putting my hands where they don't belong. I'm not sticking them with sharp things or doing surgeries unnecessarily. So the less I intervened, meaning the more time I got to sleep in the call room and ignored my responsibilities, so to speak, I was having people that were coming out with higher vaginal birth rates. They were coming out with way less, sort of disillusionment with the whole process. Mm-hmm. And that was like, there's something here. There's something here to explore. So my unwillingness to, quote, fix the problem actually led to better outcomes, which is very counterintuitive, given, nowadays we sort of entrust doctors with the ultimate authority over everything. And I didn't feel like an authority. It was like, why would I get my hands involved if it's not helping? And it's actually causing issues when I try to intervene in an otherwise natural process. So I think that my disillusionment with the medical system started early in med school, where I was like, oh man, I'm really being trained to fix the problem, but I don't necessarily think I have the tools to fix the problem in the first place. Certainly pharmaceuticals come with a lot more side effects than eating a healthy diet. And so I ended up having to reverse engineer my career after going through all the madness, like 14 years of school and training, and then finding my way out of the system so that I could actually do a better job of holding space for women and their partners in order to, welcome babies earthside in the most natural way possible.
Man, that's incredible. I was just jotting on a couple of notes, and I guess I'll have to take that question off there. Where do babies come from? But it makes total sense. Like, to have that be the answer that you'd have to come up with. Right. And in your description of, the 7 minutes piece and just how it's really turned into more of a manufacturing process, right? It's just ship it in, ship it out, move it along. And it's hard to be able to really create that relationship and do the work that's most important for your patient. So I love how you've been able to pivot that. And the other piece about, that it's not a sickness, although we treat pregnancy as that, don't we? Now, don't get me wrong. There's some women I'm sure that struggle, and there are other issues that are presented. But I really want to focus, if we can, as much as we can, on understanding what our wives and are going through and our partners. And as a man, what can we do? So talk a little bit more about the Born Free method and why this program is just as much for men as it is for their partners.
Yeah, totally. I think everybody's a different learner. I think everybody has a different desire as to how much information they want versus how much conversation they want to have. You know, some people just want to feel their way through this. I know my wife, for example, was sent, given what I do, I was sent maybe, I don't know, a dozen different pregnancy books. People were like, you got to have this one. Like everybody wanted to be sort of regarded as the person that had the right book for us, you know? And of course, with all of my training, I was like, I know a ton of stuff. I'm sure I got this all dialed in. Here, honey, you look at these books and tell me what resonates. And she ended up discarding all of them after flipping through. And we went with a book called A is for Advice, the Reassuring Kind, which we ended up, it's just like these little quips, A through Z, of kind of what to expect in pregnancy. And we spent time in the bathtub reading passages back and forth. Very short book, like maybe 100 pages. And I loved it because it really, the process really helped me understand that my wife wasn't really looking for advice. She was really looking for somebody to just see her for what this is, which is you're losing your old identity. In fact, there's nothing safe about childbirth. Like you are going to die. Your old self dies and the mother emerges. The same is for the fathers. So if a father wants to be, if a man wants to be involved in the Born Free method, there's plenty of information there, but there's also plenty of exercises for you to connect intimately. And I'm not talking about like, you know, intercourse. I mean, like looking into a person's eyes, like really appreciating what this means for them. A lot of our female partners, because of the media and mother culture, they're worried that they're not going to be attractive afterwards. They're worried that they're going to be broken, like physically not working anymore afterwards. Their pelvis is going to open up to let out a 10-pound baby maybe, and then close back up. Like there's this portal that opens and closes. This is a tremendous experience for somebody. So as a man, you're thinking, okay, how do we avoid the complications? How do we do all this stuff? That's a part of the process. But what's also important, and this was the best piece of advice I was given as a male OBGYN who had been to thousands of births, was don't focus so much on the day of the birth. You and this person that you're holding through this process, your partner, your wife, whoever is going, you guys are going to have to be connected for the next 18 years while this kid finds his way into adulthood. And that is really, really what's lacking. We all focus on the moment of birth and we forget we have to survive this as a couple. I'm dying, you're dying, our family is dying and being reborn with another human being in it. And so my wife and I, having met when we were 6, we ended up, you know, thinking we probably had it all dialed in, but then there's this tremendous shift. Well, as a man, I wish I would have had it modeled for me. You know, what is not just the roles and responsibilities. Yes, there's the, you know, burning sage, the diffuser, you know, the back rubs, all the acupressure points. There's all of that. That's really, really helpful. If your partner wants that. My wife really didn't want anything. She wanted to be left alone and in the zone. I remember burning sage and copal and making her lemonade. She was like, enough sage, enough. Like she was just overwhelmed sensorially. So what I like to reframe for the gentleman is, you know, if you're going through the Born Free method or otherwise, there's all these exercises. There's the journaling exercises. There's guided meditations to connect more deeply to your partner, to yourself, to the baby inside the uterus. That's all really, really helpful. But there's also what I like to reframe for people. And there's a whole unit just for the dads, because this is basically the content I would have loved. The opportunity there, and this is key for every guy that's listening, the opportunity of having a baby with your partner is that you get to exercise masculinity to its fullest. And if I may unpack that.
Absolutely.
When you leave a woman undisturbed in birth, you get to see the full power, immeasurable power of the feminine. And we are getting a little bit into this like David data space, you know, the divine masculine and divine feminine is more than a vulva and a penis. It's more than a big, strong guy and soft, tender caretaker. It is the mountain versus the river. So the analogy I give people is there's a river careening through. I was just up in Hell's Canyon for a week-long rafting trip, class 4 rapids. The river you're a part of the river. You're at the whim of the river. And the river is wild and trying to buck you off and spinning you around. And there's these whirling jetties and rapids and all this crazy stuff. Meanwhile, Up in Idaho, these rugged mountains are standing on either side of us, and it's providing a container. It's providing counter pressure so that the river can flow down a gradient and create a great experience for those who are riding on it. So the river is the divine feminine. That is the embodiment of the feminine. And the masculine is there holding an anchor. It's holding strong and just receiving the river. The mountain doesn't tell the river where to go. Meanwhile, the river might be eroding the mountain over here and depositing some over there. And the mountain is just standing there, open palms, open chest, and receiving that. That is the ultimate embodiment of a man in childbirth. So if you think you're a tough guy, I do jujitsu. I have this triathlon background. I was a rock climber. I just had 12 hours of neck and chest tattoo, which we can get into because there's actually something there for the guys as well as an initiation. But the toughest man out there is somebody who can sit still and allow their partner to go through this thing without disturbing them, without trying to fix that problem. That is a tremendous task, but that is exactly the role, because oxytocin, created in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, is expressed through the pituitary. It's a neurotransmitter and a hormone, and it governs over everything from ejaculation to conception, to the ejection of the baby, the fetal ejection reflex, to the milk letdown reflex from the breast when your partner is feeding the baby. Oxytocin is the love hormone, to simplify it. Synthetic stuff they give you in the hospital does not do this. But oxytocin is a chemical binding agent between you and your baby, both for mom and dad, especially for mom, because, you know, baby has a special connection, been flooded by your chemicals this whole 9.5-month gestation period. But when you disturb a person, when you're asking them questions, when you're talking to them, when you're distracting them in some way from the inner work, you are going to suppress, you may, without intention, be increasing their catecholamines by asking them things that they don't necessarily want to know. Did you ever have a bowel obstruction? Have you thought about if your baby dies? Have you, let me do this and poke you here and stick my hands in here and do all this stuff? That is actually potentially going to lead to a traumatizing, let's say a lasting traumatizing effect, like a PTSD-like response, because this person, your partner, is trying to do that inward work, and oxytocin can't do that if it's being suppressed by a flood of catecholamines, by a person being scared or heightened even through their senses. So most women, when they're left alone in their home, will often be found on the floor in like a prayer position, trying to block out all sensory information, because they are flooded with oxytocin, and that mechanism, this positive feedback loop, bringing your baby into the world, can't be disturbed for this to go completely uncomplicated in a very natural way. So the role of the man, one way to view it, could be to eliminate every distraction that your partner doesn't want, and having conversations around that. What do you smell in the room, honey? What do you hear in the room? Like, who is there? What voices do, like all of that stuff. You know, my wife, when we were walking on a hike before our first birth, and she said, "Tell me about the day of our birth. Just walk me through the day." And I was like, "Well, first your contractions are going to start, and then they're going to pick up in intensity, and then we'll have to do this and this." And she was like, no, stop. You're giving me the linear sequence of events. Tell me about what the experience feels like to you. And this goes back to my father. What does it feel like to be somebody who's looking down the hallway and seeing the dead end? That's a scary place to be. But for me, I'd now been asked this important question. It allowed us to dream up the landscape, the ambiance of our birth. And sure enough, it was low lights. It was less talking. It was just touching when it's, appropriate. I'll tell you when that happens. And my wife went into her own little space. So the role for me was to not show up to this situation looking to solve some sort of problem I've created in my head, but rather to get out of the way and to not be in, not trying to guide the river, but standing firm and putting, I don't want to say boundaries, because that sounds like I'm sort of, controlling it, but putting some pressure on the sides of the river. I've got you, so that the river can do its thing. If the mountain wasn't there, the river would just turn into a puddle. So I'm speaking a lot in allegory and metaphor here, but this is why this is hard work. I don't think there's enough men talking about this and feeling invited into this space to really explore the opportunity that childbirth presents, somebody who wants to embrace their masculinity.
Man, that is just so powerful, Nathan. And I think it is true. It absolutely is true, is that we don't talk about this because we just don't know how to have that conversation. And what I really appreciated, there's just so many so many great bombs that you just dropped in there. I was just making some note. I hadn't considered that when my wife was pregnant, that a part of her was dying. She was now going to be mom, and the concerns for her, for how she may feel as, am I as sexy as I was before childbirth?
Right.
Will I be desired? And that is something I don't think, we as guys, depending on who we are, just, the pocket and a fur coat is enough for us to be excited. We just have to, we don't really dive and understand where to be in. And and I love that you're using allegory, because it makes so much, it really drives home the story, because when you talked about the rapids and how can we show up as men, what a better way than for us to be there as that strong piece, not fixing, but to be present, and truly what it means to be present, to be there. And your question, when you were doing your walk and you talked about, and she asked you what was the day going to be like, and how a typical dude would answer is going through the linear step 1, step 2, step 3, but no, the experiential piece. And I think we're at a time today where men are finally understanding that it's actually pretty cool when we embrace the experience of life versus being the doers of life. And when we can be the beers of life and slow down for a minute, instead of trying to accomplish everything in a linear or a 3-step process. And so your how you've described that is just so powerful, and I think is going to really resonate with our audience, because we have a fair amount of, I'll say, early to mid 30s in that are attracted to this, and then we kind of skew off a little bit older. But there's lots of us guys now having kids at a I'll say a little bit older. I had mine in my 24, 26 era age group, right? Guys are still having kids now. Couples are having kids much later. And I think you're probably seeing that in your practice as well, right? With this drive in Western civilization to, have the career, get things kind of set up, and then have kids a little bit later. And, I had married my high school sweetheart, and if I would have left it up to her, we would have had kids right out of high school. And not for a lack of trying, things just didn't happen that way. It's just, just the way life goes.
Yeah. I have a little story to share with you that I think most of the men in that age group will probably resonate with, which is, well, first off, let me also comment that as we get older, we actually get more habituated to the typical ways of showing up. If you're 45 and you're trying to have a baby, and let's say your partner's in her late 30s or something. So we're talking to the men here. You've had 45 years maybe of practicing how to swing the bat, maybe a little bit incorrectly. And it takes a lot of courage. So if you're listening and you're like, oh, there's something to this, it's okay. Most people are going to be a little bit confronted by this, especially if you've been doing it for 45 years. So I do a lot of fertility work as well. And so many couples think that I'm going to biohack their way into having a baby, right? In their labs, we do the labs and the imaging, we do all that stuff, but it actually ends up coming down to you guys haven't connected, like really connected. Like just putting the penis in the vagina and having that sex is not real sex. That's just like, you could just masturbate and that would be probably just fine for your partner. Really connecting to somebody, and I'm not getting into the tantra path and all of that, but really connecting with somebody does require you to do quite a bit of work. It's a very active process to love somebody and to make them feel seen, which is why I think so many women, especially as they get older, don't feel they're afraid of their body changing. They're afraid of, like what you said, not being as attractive or as sexy after this process, because also the media, portrays beauty as like a 15-year-old maiden. But, we won't go down that path right now. So the opening up, like getting a person to just open up like my father did at the very end of his life, that is actually a really, really big part from preconception all the way through raising kids. And that opening up process is a receptive process. You have to open yourself up to receiving somebody else. So we're kind of flipping the roles there. Typically the yin, the feminine, is the receiver, and the masculine is the deliverer, right? But sometimes when our partners bring a problem to us, we actually have to just be okay receiving that. And that's a real challenge. So I'll share a little exercise. Well, it's not really an exercise you can practice right now, although you could try just sitting and listening and like being present with your partner when they want to share something important. I've never been very good at this. So that's the other thing is I want to tell people like, you're never just going to like finally get it and it's done. Like this is a constant work in progress. You and your partner wake up as different people every single day. But my wife and I, we used to go to Burning Man all the time, but then we had kids and that we tried going last year and it was a total disaster. So with the kids, with the girls, but our first or second trip, I can't remember, to Burning Man, we went to this event called the Emotathon. And it was sort of a first come, first serve, 30 women, 30 men. And they invited people who were just up for like a really interesting experiment, right? So the 30 women stayed in the tent and they kind of prepped themselves in some way, who knows? The men were taken outside and there was a male and female leader of the group. The female leader was with the women and vice versa. So we went outside and they started a couple exercises, which were really to help practice holding space. And this holding space concept will make sense without me even explaining it in a way that I probably won't even, I'll probably just verbal diarrhea it. But imagine a man walking up to you in a bar and yelling in your face. The first thing that happens is you get prickly on the neck. You start to get like your heart rate goes and you're thinking, brace yourself, like something's going to happen here. So we immediately go into flight or fight. Could you do that? Could you actively control your nervous system and not respond like that? Well, in this little preparation exercise for what was to come, you were randomly paired up with another guy and you would take turns. So I stood there and they said, put your chin down, keep your chest out, turn your palms outward and just open yourself up. And this other person is going to come and scream in your face. Just emote anything. It can be laughing, it can be screaming, it can be yelling, it can be whatever. Just let all of that pent up whatever come out at this other person. And your job as the person receiving was to just stand there and receive it, not react. That is a extremely hard thing to do when a linebacker looking guy is screaming at you. But I did it. And then we switched roles and I let him have it. Actually started crying. And it wasn't because I was scaring him. It was because he was allowing himself to feel what I was feeling. So just let that sit in for a second. When we allow a person to feel when we allow ourselves to feel what another person is feeling, it can activate certain emotions in our body. And it wasn't anger. It was whatever. Who knows what was coming up for him? So we went through a variety of exercises like that, and it was very challenging. But then we all went inside, and we didn't really know what was coming. But for the next 2.5 hours, the women were sitting all together, and the men were all standing. And the women would one by one stand up and pick somebody from the crowd who reminded them of a man that had abused them, had hurt them, had left them. And the stories were very sort of dramatically different. On one case, it was a woman pointed out somebody from the crowd, we're all men. So these are men in their lives. The man was their father who died too early. In another case, it was their alcoholic grandfather who sexually molested them. And it was 3 people who gang raped them in a parking lot. It was that wide of a variety. There was one woman who had a colostomy bag and she took all of her clothes off and she said to the guy, made me feel disgusting because of my illness. She had like Crohn's disease or something and had a colostomy her whole life. You made me feel dirty. You made me feel less than a woman, less than, sexy, whatever. And us men, one by one, some of us were pulled out, some of us weren't. We're just there to receive this. Sometimes they were slapping, they would ask permission. Sometimes there was pushing, but it was just unemotion. And our job was to receive that. And I tell them there was not a single dry eye amongst the men in the room. We were all finally feeling what women were feeling in our lives. And that is the exercise in childbirth. You are going to have to feel what they're feeling. And I don't mean you're going to feel like your pelvis is opening and all that. But you're going to have to bear witness to the person you love the most going through a very real death experience. And that is tremendously hard. But the good news is there's an incredible opportunity. If you can do that, that sets the stage, a reinvigoration for your entire life together thereafter and for the life of that.
Yeah, no kidding. Oh, man, I got goosebumps. My heart's racing just listening to that story and that experience. The idea of being able to really learn a process that way. And you, as you were talking a little bit earlier and, about the 12-hour ordeal and with the tattoo you were doing, you went through, and then this experience, and the note I wrote down was rite of passage. And how does that experience, some of this, we talk about a lot of that, and a lot of that in men's work is this idea of doing a rites of passage. And this too, this experience that we're talking about today here as couples is truly a rite of passage, because you talked about
Absolutely.
the most powerful way that we can express our masculinity is that presence. And so talk a little bit about, you wanted to share a little bit more about the 12-hour ordeal and how we can really stitch this together. And maybe it is a bit of a rite of passage, and maybe it's not, but let's talk a little bit about that too, because I think you have some nuggets here that are going to really be important that'll help tie some things we're talking about together.
Yeah, I said 12 hours. And as you were saying that, I was adding it up. It was closer to 17, not straight through. But what we're talking about here, guys, if you can't see, is I have a lot of ink, fresh ink on my neck and chest. I have other tattoos, but this was a very large project, including my right arm. And I went down, and Heidi Scheck is the tattooer. That's apparently what tattoo artists are called, tattooers. I didn't know that. I thought that sounded funny too. But I found her through a friend, Kyle Kingsbury. He's a former UFC fighter. He's a good friend of mine. And he said, hey, Heidi might be your lady. So I checked her out. We chatted, and it was a good click. If you guys are looking to have a tattoo that you're going to sit for 17 hours for, you need somebody that you can actually vibe with. Yeah. And Heidi drew up this beautiful illustration, and it includes my collarbones over both brachial thigh here, right in that soft spot, right above the collarbones, and my neck, and around my nipples, not on the nipples, and then the sternum, like a lot of really tender, soft spots, like spots you don't want a needle going in and out, 1,000 RPMs or whatever. So why am I talking about tattoos? The process of having a baby, many women do say, I felt like I was dying, right? And there's no true initiation without death being on the line. That's how I know birth is important. That's how I've always known that this is important. And that's how I always knew I would never have the answer to this test. But as a man, I'm never going to have that initiation. I'm never going to have the rite of passage of having a baby. So what gives? Well, my wife brought this up when we were talking about the tattoo, because I told her I hit a point where I didn't think I could have any more pain. And people probably think like, boo-hoo, bro, you got a tattoo. You paid money for somebody to hurt you and all this. Not the same as birth. I get that. I'll never have a baby though. And maybe the most painful thing I've ever gone through, despite the Ironman, despite jujitsu, despite CrossFit and injuring myself and all this stuff over my life, losing my father, all of these things, sitting and not being able to stop while a person is hurting you is a bit of an initiation. Your nervous system starts to tell you you're dying. Like you're going to die if this pain doesn't stop. This is why torture is so effective at getting people to share like anything to stop this, because my body is starting to die. Your nervous system hits a wall, after which you can actually start being traumatized. There's a PTSD-like response. And I actually got a little taste of that. At about the last hour or so on the fourth day of the tattoo, I started like dissociating from my body, which sounds like it's healthy, but it's not like I dissociated and then it got better. It just kept going. And then she was like, 20 more minutes, I think. We got to touch up some spots. And it just kept getting worse and worse. And towards the end, I was so over it that my lower jaw started chattering. It was like, you're coming to the end of your trial and you're not going to be able to finish. It's like seeing the finish line and just saying, forget the marathon, I'm done. I was hitting that point, and that had I gone for further, there may have actually been, and Heidi, my tattoo artist, she told me that there is potentially trauma that can be done through this process if you're not aware of when you're hitting that wall. So I just brushed over the wall whenever the tattoo finished. And the reason I say all of this is that I don't think everybody out there needs to go and get a painful tattoo in order to prove themselves as a man or anything. But if you want to experience what it must be like to give birth and to not be able to get out of that, like the roller coaster is going down the hill, there's no turning back. There's no way I would change my mind. You're in it. You're in it. And that's what our women are going through. So if we can appreciate that somehow, whether it's your own form of your own rite of passage, a lot of cultures still have rites of passage. We're lacking that sorely in North America. There are vision quests where you go fasting for days. And if you don't kill something, you don't eat. Like there are lots of ways to do this. I do think the lack of ritual and ceremony, and especially initiation when death is on the line, because like I said, it's not a real initiation if there's nothing to lose. And getting a painful tattoo is certainly not birth. But that might be the closest thing that I'll ever get to really appreciating how this pain, this unrelenting pain, can lead to trauma in the body if that stress is not integrated well afterwards. And so in birth, another thing that men can do, again, get out of the way. You can ask them what they want. And if they want something, they'll know to prompt you. But getting out of the way and then helping to close that circle ceremonially after the fact is so important. It's not just the baby's out, go back to work or go back to working out and doing your own, your bullshit. Like, you have to be still and be present in order to help close that gap. Otherwise, your partner might end up being very resentful if they don't feel appreciated, if they don't feel like you were seeing them, if you were bearing witness to this horrible thing that they went through. It is really, really important for guys to understand that this is a true initiation for women, and us men may never experience that. So I think can lean on the tattoo experience. And that was like on that border of being maybe traumatized, my nervous system anyways. I feel like I can relate now to when people say, even when they had an uncomplicated natural birth, that they relate with like PTSD, like, symptoms. There's something that was deeply traumatizing. And it could be the way that they were handled in the hospital. It could be the way they were spoken to. It could be the way that you didn't really feel present during their birth. That can all lead to some really scary stuff for the women in our lives, especially when they're bringing in the baby, our baby Earthside.
Yeah. Man, what a great way to put that all together. And it's so true, as our own piece, or our own little rite of passage. And I'm listening to you talk about this, and I'm just thinking about how crappy of a husband I was to my first wife. She was my high school sweetheart. And so when we had our two kids, and just how unconscious I was through that whole process, one, just being shit scared about what was going on and happening, and just not having the awareness. And so that's, I come back to saying how we started this conversation is so needed, and getting prepared to talk with you, and, creeping your socials and that, looking at it, I just thought this is going to be a powerful conversation. I have yet to hear it talked the way you spoke about it today on any podcast. And I listen to lots, especially in the men's sphere. And I think, Nathan, you're just, the work that you're doing for families, couples, and helping men to really understand and how we can truly show up is outstanding work. And so what would be the best piece of advice that you would give a new father that's about ready to be a dad, and what would be that piece of advice, and how can he show up best?
I think that one's pretty easy for me. Remember that your dad was just doing his best. He was just doing what he thought was the right thing to do. He was probably not intentionally doing anything wrong. He was just doing his best. And we need more men to step up as great model fathers and then future grandfathers, so we can raise good boys and good girls, raise good people. We're all just doing our best. We have to give one another a break. We really, I think most of all, need to give ourselves a break sometimes.
Yeah, completely agree with that. Of everything that we spoke about today, and maybe there was one thing we didn't get a chance to touch on, what would be the one takeaway you'd want all of us to have from our conversation?
I just want to, I guess, reiterate that birth, we've already said this, it's not a medical procedure, and pregnancy is not a disease. This is not an accessory to your life. This is a tremendous opportunity to grow up. And that's a good thing. Of all the ways that we can, adult, of all the things we can do in our life, we're worried about losing our freedom to travel and all this other stuff. There is no greater leveling up. It's like eating a mushroom in Super Mario. There's no greater leveling up than becoming a parent. It is the hardest thing, and it's so cliche. It's the hardest thing, and also the most guaranteed to you laugh and smile more than anything that you will ever do. No amount of MDMA, Molly, can give you the joy that having a little girl come up to you and just hug your leg as hard as they can and try to say dada. That's what my 1.5-year-old's doing now. It is their laugh, the belly laugh, the giggles, the like little hippo teeth that are all over the place. They're unbridled joy. So maybe the corollary to that would be try to see the world through your kids' eyes, and everything else will make sense. It is a true blessing. And it's also it's a great honor to be here with you, Alan. So thank you for having me on. This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Nathan, for sharing this and helping us really understand how men can be better partners and husbands for our wives that going through pregnancy, and reminding us that it's not just about that day. It's about the relationship of the 18 plus years that we are now building with this new addition to our families. So if folks are interested in getting a hold of you and participating in your work, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Well, the course that I mentioned before is called the Born Free Method. That's really my magnum opus. That is everything that I'm asked about in pregnancy, postpartum, and beyond. It's for preconception. It's for pregnant people. It's for postpartum people. It's for people that maybe want to have kids in the future. It's for birth workers. It's for dads just as much as it is their ladies. That's bornfreemethod.com. Jump on an enrollment call. We will definitely love to have you in our community if you're coming to us through this show. And then my practice is belovedholistics.com. You can find all of my one-on-one work there. And the podcast I have is called The Holistic OBGYN. So we talk quite a bit more about some of these things related to fatherhood, etc. And then Nathan Riley OBGYN is my socials. So
outstanding. I'll make sure all that's in the show notes for this episode so people can reach out. Once again, thank you so much for being on the show. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Yeah, likewise, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is The Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net and start forging a new destiny today.